Welcome to Move the Sticks. I'm Bucky Brooks, but I am joined. This is a special guest. This is my man, Marcas coming over. We're doing a crossover podcast. So, look, I know you guys have been itching. I know everyone is getting ready for their fantasy drafts, getting ready for their fantasy season, getting ready for the wild and zany fantasy bets that you have in these leagues where you get tattoos. And I just saw online where somebody had to take Winnie the Pooh to dinner because they came in last in the league. And so everyone is gearing up. And Marcus, you may not know this, but you're talking to a 3-time fantasy league champion over here.
Okay.
Someone who way back in the day on one of our competitor sites, I used to play fantasy in the early 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to give it up. I had to give up that narcotic because it was overwhelming my Sunday life. And it was a league that didn't lock on the weekend. So you can imagine watching games, watching the running back go down, but knowing that the waiver wire was still active and being on your phone and picking up the handcuff right then. So I had to give it up. It was overwhelming my life. But look, man, it's good to have you on. Like, tell me a little bit about your fantasy journey, because I'm so curious in terms of like our experts and you guys. Like, how did you become kind of like the fantasy know-it-all?
Yeah, honestly, this job sort of found me more than I found it. It really was the case. I had been working in radio for a long time. My radio job had sort of dried up. I was kind of unemployed. A former coworker suggested that I just apply to jobs at the NFL. They were always looking for people seasonally. And no lie, I just went to like NFL.com/jobs or whatever it was. And I applied for like 5 or 6 things, most of which I wasn't even qualified for. Nothing. This was 2011, so the lockout was happening. Nobody knew if there was going to be a season. I kind of forgot about it because nothing happened for a couple of months. I got a phone call from Michael Fabiano, who was the fantasy lead at the time, asking me if I wanted to interview for a job writing about fantasy football. And I was like, does it pay? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, sure. So I went in, did the interview. A couple weeks later, I remember turning on the TV and seeing the news that the lockout was over. And a couple hours after that, I got a call saying, hey, you got the job, come on in, sign the paperwork. And so August will make 12 years. I mean, I started off kind of as a seasonal employee the first 2 seasons. I would work from like August to about March, and then they would send me out into the wilderness for 5 months and bring me back, and then finally after 2 seasons of that, they finally gave me a full-time gig. And I've been lucky to sort of just work my way up from just being basically a copy editor to doing some podcast hits to, now getting to host the podcast and be on Fantasy Live. And yeah, so I'm getting ready to start my 12th year come August at the NFL.
That is so bananas. I joined NFL media in 2009. And so you just talk about like the many iterations of NFL media, the explosion of fantasy football. And look, I think it's a perfect time to have you on because so many things are bubbling up around the league when it comes to like fantasy. Daily fantasy has a different strategy than what you would do like over a season. And so like when you learn and you just kind of leaned in, first got to ask, were you a fantasy football player before you joined the NFL back in 2011?
Not seriously. I just played sort of socially, kind of casually. It was a way to, at the time, for a while, I was living in the Central Valley in Fresno, and it was a good way to meet people and kind of make friends in a city I didn't know anybody. I played in a league with guys from high school because it was just a way to keep up with guys I didn't see on the regular. But no, I was never playing it in a serious way. In fact, I don't even know if I should tell this, but my first year I was there, we had a league amongst a bunch of the digital editors, just kind of a fun casual league. I went 0 for the season.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I've had those moments. Sometimes it's the luck of the draw. Your draft is off and you just can't get it going. That is funny. So now here's my thing, because everyone has their own strategies when it comes to drafting players and building the team. What is the number one thing? Imagine I'm a newbie. I've never played fantasy. What is the number one thing that I would need to think about if I'm building a fantasy football team?
The one thing I would just tell you is because I think the number one mistake for new players is, hey, quarterbacks score the most points, so that's the first guy I should draft, right? Don't do that. And I go back to like the first time I ever played fantasy football. I think it was 1994. I was in college. The first guy I ever drafted was Dan Marino, but at that time we didn't know better. I mean, that was just kind of what you did. So don't necessarily spend your first round pick on a quarterback if you are brand new. Look at a top notch running back or a top level wide receiver is probably the way to go early in your drafts.
So no, it's funny. So the team building process, because DJ and I, like on Move the Sticks, we always talk about team building. So this is a perfect opportunity to do team building, but in the fantasy world. And so if you're saying so in whatever reality, if we're building a team, it's quarterback, it's pass rushers, it's playmakers, and then it's pass protectors is kind of how you build it out. So now you're telling me from a fantasy standpoint, you're thinking running backs and pass catchers. What are some other things that we need to know if we're trying to build an ideal team that can vie for championships in fantasy?
I think one of the other things that has become apparent the last few years is it pays to go get yourself a top level tight end. It's a position where you only start one, in most leagues you only start one tight end, and there are right now maybe 7 or 8 guys that you can feel confident with on a week to week basis, right? Like Travis Kelce is still the king among tight ends, but then, just below him, you got guys like Mark Andrews and TJ Hawkinson, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts. But there are really only about 8 guys that you feel like, can give you decent scoring on a week to week basis. After that, it's just a grab bag. And you're sort of, if you're beyond that, you're just kind of praying that your guy gets you a touchdown each and every week, and that's kind of a hard way to live. So it really is. So it's worth maybe in that 3rd or 4th round, maybe 4th or 5th round, I'll say, take a look at getting yourself a quality tight end, because it's just one less headache you'll have when you're setting your lineup every week.
Okay, so let's set it. So in most traditional leagues, we have how many running backs? Like 2 running backs?
2 running backs, yeah.
2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, a tight end. Is there a flex included in that? Or
most leagues will have a flex, which if you're not familiar with it, it allows you can either play a running back or a wide receiver. Sometimes you can play a tight end in your flex spot. But usually it's a running back wide receiver, so you can take a 3rd player at that position.
Okay, so in thinking about that, let's talk about running back. So for you, from a fantasy standpoint, what are we looking at to be an RB1 in fantasy? Are we looking at a guy that compiles a bunch of rushing yards, someone that gets like a bunch of receiving yards, a touchdown vulture that just around the goal line? Like, what are the characteristics that we're looking for in that RB1?
It's a guy that is going to be on the field a lot, and he's going to get the ball a lot, whether it's as a rusher or as a receiver. I mean, right now when you look at the top running backs in fantasy football, Christian McCaffrey, because he's always on the field and he's going to get a lot of carries. He's also going to catch the football. Austin Eckler, sort of a similar thing there. One of the guys that's an RB1 that sort of breaks the mold, Derrick Henry, doesn't catch the ball quite as much as some of these other guys, but he's going to get a lot of carries. And that when he's right, Derrick Henry's going to get you, probably 1,500 rushing yards. He's going to get you, 10 touchdowns. So he's just kind of a monster. Nick Chubb is another guy like that, where he doesn't necessarily catch it a ton. He'll catch it just enough to kind of, be viable, but he's going to get you a lot in the rushing sphere. So, yeah, and the workhorse running back as a genre is sort of dying right now, but those guys that are going to be playing, 70, 80 or more % of the snaps. They're going to be getting 20 to 30 touches per game. Those are the guys that you really want to target early in your draft.
And I know this has to be the part that is frustrating in fantasy, because to me, it's frustrating as an old school football fan. The running back committee, the running back by committee situation, the Shanahan system where, man, one guy goes bonkers one week, then the next week you're like, where is he? How do you navigate when you're trying to pick the running backs that you want on your team? How much do you consider the committee situation and the uncertainty of the touches that they may get on a week-to-week basis?
Yeah, it's hard. I will say that because it's becoming more prevalent across the league, we've gotten more practice at trying to navigate that situation. And for a lot of teams, it's become easier because there's sort of a division of labor, right? You have that guy that is going to be kind of the running back, right? He's going to be the traditional, maybe between the tackles back. He's the guy who gets short yardage, maybe goal line situations. And then you'll have that guy who's more of your change of pace, maybe your pass catching back. I mean, I think a good example of that last year, for instance, was in Detroit, where, Jamal Williams was kind of the hammer, scored a ton of touchdowns. And you had DeAndre Swift, who was kind of more your speed back. He'd catch the football. And both those guys found a way to prosper in that backfield. I mean, the Browns did it a couple years ago with Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. So we started to kind of figure it out. I will say this. We can deal with 2 running back committees. If it's just 2 guys rotating through, you can deal with it. When there's a 3rd guy that gets into the mix, then it becomes a complete headache. And then, as you mentioned, the Shanahan family in general. First, it was Mike Shanahan. Now it's Kyle Shanahan. Adam Rank came up with the term called Shanahanigans, because you just never really knew what they were going to do on a week-to-week basis. So they were sort of the outlier. But for most coaches, we've kind of figured out how they use their backs, and that's given us an idea of how to draft those backs.
So if running back's one of the marquee positions, wide receiver is certainly the one where people are just loading up. And we're seeing a league now where they're just throwing it all over the yard. We're talking about 20 to 25 guys having 1,000-yard seasons, stuff like that. So what is it that you're looking for in a number 1 receiver on your fantasy lineup?
A lot of targets, a lot of targets. I mean, like right now, in a lot of leagues, don't be surprised if Justin Jefferson is the number 1 overall pick this year. And in a lot of the early, now mind you, like the folks that I'm drafting with right now are, kind of like me. They're kind of sickos who've been drafting for a long time. But, in a lot of these drafts, it's not uncommon to see 6, 7 wide receivers come off the board in the first round. Whereas maybe 5 years ago, it was, 6 or 7 running backs and a handful of wide receivers. So like the guys like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, even Devontae Adams still has some first round value. Stephon Diggs. These are guys that are the alphas in their passing games. It helps if they play in an offense that throws the ball a lot. But either way, if you can look at a guy and say that, reasonably believe he's going to get you 130, 150 targets, those are the guys that are probably going to be gone in the first round or early part of the second round in your draft.
So fantasy is matching reality, because we are seeing the league has shifted to a pass-centric focus where it's about the quarterback and the playmaker. Look at who's getting paid. Quarterbacks, wide receivers. The running backs have fallen by the wayside. They're no longer the marquee player on offense. They're not getting paid like that. And so we're seeing it match up. And so now you're talking about targets, and that when you're looking at getting a wide receiver, do you worry about his supporting cast? Do you want someone who doesn't have a complementary weapon, or do you want him to kind of be the standalone figure? So think about DeAndre Hopkins for years in Houston was like a one-man show. Do we want the one-man show, or do we want someone that may have a complement on the other side to take some of the pressure away from him so he can get one-on-ones?
I think this is where it sort of depends on the offense and the quarterback in particular. Like I immediately think of Cincinnati, right? Where Jamar Chase is there. T. Higgins can still thrive in that offense along with him, because the Bengals are going to throw the ball a lot. A guy like Joe Burrow can go out and support multiple pass catchers. I think you see the same. And I think you could in Buffalo. They don't really have another guy beyond Stephon Diggs but I think Josh Allen could support multiple guys. Patrick Mahomes can, right now they just lean on Travis Kelce, but you look at other offenses like DeAndre Hopkins going to Tennessee. I don't know that they can support a whole lot of guys there. So Hopkins is going to get his. He's for sure going to eat. The question is, how much does that impact a guy like Treylon Burks, or, a lot of us like, Chig Okonkwo as kind of a sleeper tight end? Is that offense built to funnel enough targets to all 3 of those guys? Can they all be successful when you still got to get Derrick Henry his touches? You've got Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, who is fine. I mean, he's sort of oatmeal when it comes to quarterbacks. He's nothing special. He's not going to kill you, but he's nothing special either. So that looks like an offense where it looks like it'll be DeAndre Hopkins eating a lot and everybody else sort of fighting for whatever's left over in the passing game.
Yeah, no, it is funny how when you're making those decisions in fantasy, if you can kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together and trying to figure out, like, okay, if he's the number 1, does he have enough to prevent the team from double teaming him? DeAndre Hopkins, you would like to think he's going to get a lot of targets, not only because they don't have an established target, but you still have to worry about Derrick Henry. And so now when you're thinking like, hey, he's going to get one-on-ones, maybe he's getting 8 to 10 a game, even though he can't run, maybe he's able to put some points up, touchdowns, and those things. And so as I think about that, because you told me I got 2, maybe 3 slots for my wide receivers. Mm-hmm. So in a perfect world, in both of those slots, I have 2 number 1s. But now let's say all the number 1s are gone. what am I looking for in an ideal number 2 wide receiver?
You're looking for a guy again who's going to get a decent number of targets. It would be nice if you can find maybe a red zone threat or somebody like that. A good number 2 that immediately jumps to mind to me is Mike Williams with the Chargers, who's a good downfield threat, kind of a contested catch guy, and a big target when they get near the end zone. Right, like Justin Herbert will probably be looking in his direction. He has really good number 2 wide receiver upside, or just a guy in an offense that again is going to spread the ball around. A guy that I've sort of liked in a lot of drafts this year is Brandon Ayuk in San Francisco, who, everybody looks at Deebo Samuel, understandably, and Deebo is incredibly multi-talented, but last year it was Ayuk that led that team in receptions and receiving yards, and all the drum beats out of San Francisco right now say that Ayuk just looks like a different guy. It's like he's completely bought into the system. And weirdly, I know we always talk about targets and route running and that sort of thing. Buying into the system for Kyle Shanahan for Brandon Ayuk meant blocking. It just meant actually putting an effort out and blocking when the ball wasn't coming to you or when they were running. And I think so now that he's sort of understood that that is an important part of his job, he's getting more opportunities in the passing game. And, this coming out of Arizona State was an incredibly talented guy, great after the catch. And he's a guy that is sneakily, he's kind of hanging around in like the 5th or 6th round. And wherever I have a chance, I'm trying to draft him as my second wide receiver.
Man, that is so great. It's funny you talked about Ayuk, Mike Williams. I think another one who fascinates me is, where do you categorize like Jalen Waddle? Is Waddle like a number 1? Do you treat him like a number 2? Tyreek Hill is the guy talking about going for 2,000 yards. And so, I mean, what does that do? Like, what would you do when you're trying to think about a Jalen Waddle? Is he someone that you draft high, or what do you feel like you can get him?
You have to draft him fairly, probably a little higher than you would Ayuk, but I think he's sort of in that fringe low wide receiver 1, high wide receiver 2. But you're right. Like, Tyreek Hill he's going to be the main target there. But I think the other part of it is it's a passing offense that is mostly funneled through those 2 guys. And so that gives Waddle a lot of value. I mean, the fact that, you can't teach speed, and they've got a track team down there in Miami between those 2 receivers and the running backs. That helps. So, if Tua can just get him out in space and let him run, he can pick up those after the catch yards. He can find his way into the end zone. So he really is kind of that high end wide receiver too. It's just because I think right now everybody's so excited about the Dolphins offense. The draft price has gone up on him a little bit.
Yeah, you talk about the draft price going up. Now, one of the things that I love when I watch Fantasy Live is I think it's the hype train when you get to going, y'all get to going or whatever. So like the funny part of the off season is like everybody looks great. Everybody's there. The buzz is on that. You talked about Ayuk or whatever. Who are some of the guys that are on the hype train that I need to jump on that we think might have breakout years or bigger than anticipated roles heading into the season?
Well, Bijan Robinson is the first one on the list. And, every year we seem to get, 1 or 2 rookies, usually running backs that everybody loves. And Bijan, everybody thinks he's going to go to the moon. The problem with that is that means you've got to spend a 1st round pick on Bijan. He's coming off the board right around like 8 or 9 overall in a lot of leagues, because it's sort of that perfect match of talent, being the top running back in this draft class in a situation, in an offense that wants to run the football a ton. Arthur Smith just wants to just run the hell out of the ball. And then occasionally they will use him as a pass catcher. I know they've talked about maybe putting him in the slot every once in a while to get him some targets there. So everybody loves Bijan Robinson. Another guy that is getting a lot of hype, if you are in the of the mind to draft a second quarterback, Anthony Richardson, people love him just because the rushing upside. And I mean, one of the things with quarterbacks now is we want quarterbacks that can run with the football. That's why, 2 of the top 3 guys off the board are Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, because they're going to give you that rushing upside. It's why people love Justin Fields. He's getting drafted as a top 5 guy. And so while we are all still unsure what Anthony Richardson can be as a passer, we're pretty confident he can put together, 800-900 yards on the ground. If he can get you 6 to 8 rushing touchdowns, that gives you a pretty solid floor. And then if he turns out to be a better passer than we anticipate in year 1, all of that ends up just being a bonus. So he's that guy that for me, if I'm going to wait, I might take Richardson and then I'll come back around and I'll grab like a Geno Smith or a Kirk Cousins, just to kind of give me that insurance, that cushion at the quarterback spot. But everybody loves them some Anthony Richardson in drafts right now.
So it's so funny how the league is kind of evolved, right? It went from being a passing league, and it's still a passing league, but now, boy, we love the dual threat quarterback. And in fantasy, we've always loved it. I remember the Cam Newton year when Cam Newton was MVP and just a scoring machine, and how y'all would rave about it. And so now we have this collection of these athletic quarterbacks, right? You alluded to Jalen Hurts, Justin Fields, Josh Allen, but the guy that I have, um, what do we do with Lamar Jackson? Like, are we big on Lamar Jackson? Are we pausing on Lamar Jackson? What are your thoughts on Lamar Jackson?
No, we're big on Lamar Jackson this year. One, once we got past all the contract drama and he in Baltimore decided to kiss and make up and everybody's happy again, that took a big load, I think, off of everybody's mind. And now with Todd Monk in there, I think we're expecting that this offense is going to be a little bit more aggressive through the air than it has been in the past. Now, I'm still sort of skeptical on the pass catchers. You hope a guy like Rashad Bateman is healthy. We'll see what Odell has left in the tank there. I mean, we know Mark Andrews is still going to get plenty of looks in that offense, but you take, Lamar and his rushing ability with a play caller that I think wants to take more vertical shots. Everybody loves Lamar, and I've seen him go as high as maybe being the third quarterback off the board. Right now, he's on average about the fifth quarterback taken, but I think everybody is very much back in on Lamar Jackson this year.
So there's a lot of buzz about Lamar Jackson because of all the playmakers around him, and people are super excited about that. You talked about Anthony Richardson because typically when it comes to rookie quarterbacks, people are kind of like, I don't know, or whatever. But when you listen to the people down in Carolina talk about Bryce Young, and they talk about how he has it and some of the firepower that he has around him, and they think this team can be a playoff team, what are we to do with Bryce Young when it comes to fantasy?
Bryce Young is very much kind of a late round, kind of almost a dart throw, right? I think if you play dynasty league football where you draft a player and you have him over several years, Bryce Young was being drafted fairly early. He was kind of a first round pick in a lot of rookie drafts. But I think in regular redraft leagues, everybody's taking a more cautious approach. And I think in part because, as you mentioned, of the cast around him, that, Carolina is sort of putting a patchwork together of guys who were sort of cast-offs from their previous teams, maybe getting a little bit older. I don't know what it's going to look like when, if potentially Adam Thielen and older Adam Thielen is the number one target in this offense. What does Miles Sanders have to offer after the Eagles decided they were going to move on from him? So I think that alone kind of has everybody being cautious. I will say in some of the early drafts I've done, I have taken him kind of in the double-digit rounds just because, hey man, who knows? Maybe he really does blossom in year one, but I think everybody is sort of looking at year two and beyond to see what Bryce Young can really be.
Okay, so we've talked about the hype train and the guys we're excited about. Well, now I'm gonna put on my hater hat, and we're gonna talk about some guys like Marcus. Who are the overrated? Let's start with the quarterback first. Who's the overrated quarterback that people are expecting big things, but you're like, I'm not digging this person?
Yeah, I don't know. I think when it comes to overrated quarterbacks, I don't know. Well, I'll say this, and this is not a guy that's getting drafted normally, but this is just kind of funny, is that a lot of people were taking shots at Trey Lance early on in draft season, and I didn't get it because everything the Niners said pointed to Brock Purdy being the starting quarterback when he was healthy and ready to go. I will say this. I think by this time we've kind of gotten good at drafting quarterbacks. I'm not sold on Kenny Pickett. I think people are trying to tell me a story where Kenny Pickett takes a big step forward this year. I'm not completely on board with that. I like Justin Fields, but I think my fear with him is that he's closer to his ceiling than maybe we believe him to be. The other guy, I guess, Daniel Jones. Speaking of closer to the ceiling, I think we saw the best of Daniel Jones last year.
15-5 is the best. 45 million gets me 15-5, and that's the best of it.
And here's the thing, for fantasy, where I'm drafting Daniel Jones, I think he's going to be fine for my fantasy team. I think the Giants have put themselves in football purgatory by giving him this much money. They are just going to be stuck in, they're going to be that team that either, they make the playoffs and probably get bounced in the first round, or they're just on the outside looking in, and they're going to be in that middle range of draft picks where they aren't going to get anybody to really make themselves better because they've handcuffed themselves to Daniel Jones right now.
I can't go my affiliation with the Jaguars. I'm really excited about Trevor Lawrence. I'm hoping that you share that sentiment. How do you feel about Trevor Lawrence and really the offensive playmakers on their team? How do you feel about like their chances of kind of busting out in the fantasy world?
Love them. Love the Jaguars. Especially love Trevor Lawrence. Um, Love Calvin Ridley. I mean, the fact that they were able to get him and now and plug him into an offense that was very good last year. They've re-upped with Evan Ingram. They got a lot out of Christian Kirk and Zay Jones last year. I love Trevor Lawrence. My only hesitation with the pass catchers is just that there are so many of them that, how do they split the pie a little bit? So I think if you draft a Jaguars pass catcher, it could be frustrating week to week because 1 week it might be the Calvin Ridley week, 1 week it might be the Christian Kirk week, then it might be, Travis Etienne or Evan Ingram. So that part's going to be frustrating. But in the end, the guy delivering the football, Trevor Lawrence, he's going to get his yards, his touchdowns, his points. So I absolutely love Trevor Lawrence. I think he's like the QB 7 or 8 right now, and I think that's a really good spot for him.
Well, look, so this is a really good spot. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. We're going to pause for a minute. I got some more questions on the other side of this break. All right, Marcus, coming back now. Look, man, I told you, like, this is like, I feel so fortunate that I have a personal fantasy football coach. So I know I'm going to crush my league and all this stuff. So I got a list of some other questions that I kind of want to get out there. And so we talked about the quarterbacks. We've talked about the pass catchers and those things. I think we've talked a little bit about sleepers, but because it's just you and I and no one else is really around, like, give me a handful of sleepers that are like must-haves in the fantasy world.
So one guy, I don't even know if he's a sleeper, but it's just a guy that everybody seems to every year they want to write off Tyler Lockett, and I don't understand it. Like every year people say that it's the end for Tyler Lockett, and in the end he catches 80 passes, he gets you 1,100 yards, he gets you 6 to 8 touchdowns. Who wants that? I don't know. Not it's just it just doesn't seem to make sense the way people are sort of talking down on him every single year. I also like Cam Akers as a sleeper this year, and somebody somebody last year referred to Cam Akers and Sean McVay as sort of the Ross and Rachel of the NFL because they were sort of on again, off again sort of thing. But I think by the time they got to the end of the year, the Rams realized he was their best running back, right? Darrell Henderson sort of faded away. They tried Kyron Williams, and no matter what they did, they realized Cam Akers was their best option. And so this year, I think they're just leading with that. There's nobody else on that depth chart that's going to really take any opportunities away from him. So I think Cam Akers is in for a big year. I mentioned Brandon Ayuk. I like James Cook in Buffalo. I think we saw near the end of the year last year, they started to really get him more involved in that offense. And I think I like the fact that they can use him as a pass catcher. They kept bringing in pass catching running backs last year, but never throwing them the ball. Like, they brought in Naheem Hines and they wouldn't throw him the football. And I none of us understood why that happened, but I think James Cook is going to kind of take over that role. And then the last one at quarterback, you talked about Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. I mean, I think as long as Tua stays healthy, I think big things are in the works for Tua Tagovailoa. I mean, last year when he was healthy, he was playing good football, and then unfortunately the concussions sort of derailed the season. But I think as long as the offensive line can keep him upright, with those pass catchers there, with Mike McDaniel sort of operating the switches at that offense, I think Tua can have a really big year.
Man, he can absolutely have a really big year. But you talk about watching, if he's your fantasy quarterback, man, you talk about just putting yourself through angst every week.
Yeah.
Every time he drops back to pass, and if someone gets close to him, like you're holding your breath, saying, man, I hope my guy is able to get up and kind of bounce back. It is a very interesting thing. Oh, I tell you what's interesting. Sean Payton, Russell Wilson. What do we think about the Broncos offense? Not only about Russ, but what about Jerry Jeudy, Cam? How do we feel about their playmakers?
I will say this: obviously the bet in Denver is, I guess the question for the Broncos and their fans are, will Russ cook or is Russ cooked? And I am betting that I'm going to say he's not quite cooked yet, and that Sean Payton's going to find a way to get some more out of him. We all love Jerry Jeudy, and especially because he's sort of a mid-round guy. You don't have to pay a big draft price to get Jerry Jeudy. I think the arrow is pointing up for him very much. Courtland Sutton is a guy that I've kind of liked, but it hasn't quite happened yet, and I'm not sure if it is. I think at this point he sort of is who he is. He's a nice for fantasy, at least probably a third wide receiver for you. You know, he'll give you some decent weeks, but I don't think he's ever going to blossom into that big time playmaker that we thought he could be when he was coming out of college. The other big question for me is how ready is Javonte Williams? You know, because last year we all loved him. And I remember there was a point when we weren't sure if Melvin Gordon was coming back to Denver, and we were talking about Javonte Williams as a high first round draft pick. That all changed once Gordon, you know, re-signed in Denver or what have you. And then unfortunately, Williams gets hurt with that major knee injury. Now he's saying he's going to be ready to go. The Broncos are sounding optimistic about it. And so that's cool. But I mean, you've seen guys with knee injuries like that. It usually takes them a while to sort of get back into the flow of things. So I want to see, I love Javonte coming out of North Carolina. I kind of like what he can do. But at the same time, they also have Samaje Perine as a nice sort of insurance policy who can catch the football, who can get some of those hard yards for you. So I'm drafting Javonte, but I'm drafting him sort of as a third or fourth running back, where if he does come back healthy and is ready to go, then I feel really great about my running back situation. And if it takes him a while to kind of get back up to speed, then, you know, I haven't risked a lot in draft capital. I've got, you know, hopefully two or three other guys ahead of him that I can feel confident in starting.
Okay, so this may be unpopular, but we've kind of gone through all the marquee positions in fantasy. I have to ask you, are kickers valuable in fantasy? Is there a place for the kicking game? Do we care about that? Do we just grab somebody at the end of the draft and throw them in there? Is there a strategy when it comes to acquiring a kicker in the fantasy world?
So I still think there's a place for kickers in the game, but increasingly leagues are sort of doing away with that. You know, a lot of leagues now are doing away with kickers and adding an extra flex spot. But I'm like, you know, kickers are people too, right? They have feelings. They have feelings. They have souls. Like let's involve them. That being said, it is very rare that I draft a kicker. You know, I will spend those last few rounds maybe taking, you know, a rookie that I think has a chance to get on the field, or just kind of a younger player that has some upside, maybe a chance to make plays. Now, chances are when it gets to week one and I got to set my lineup, that last round pick is probably the first guy I'm going to cut so I can add a kicker. But, you know, hey, maybe you draft a guy and then you hear some news, you know, leading up to week one about him getting more reps, or, you know, you don't ever wish for injury, but maybe the guy in front of him gets hurt and suddenly there's going to be a lot more snaps. So it's worth doing that. So I still believe in kickers. I still think it's cool. Weirdly, I actually play in some, because I do this and I play in a lot of weird leagues. I play in some where they have tweaked the kicker scoring to make it so like you are actually sort of intrigued about drafting kickers. I'm in a slow draft now and I'm like looking around, I'm like, I'm in round like 13 of this slow draft. Maybe in a couple more rounds, I might look at Justin Tucker or somebody like that, because, you know, like he might score more than some other team's third wide receiver.
Okay, so if we talk about kickers, now we got to talk about defense. Do I draft a defense or do I just sign one off the waiver wire? Like, what are your strategies when it comes to defense?
No, I still think it's worth drafting a defense, because you still have yours at your elite ones kind of at the top, right? You know that, you know, San Francisco, Philadelphia, for instance, those teams. You know, I think Dallas, another one, that those are going to be teams that are going to do well for you. You know, obviously on bye weeks you're going to have to make the switch out, but I still think there's a value in drafting a defense. And the two things I look at when going after a defense: can you get sacks and can you force turnovers? Those are the two things that are mostly going to get you points in fantasy there for your defense. So that's, you know, that's why I talk about Dallas, right? They've got pass rushers. Philly's got pass rushers. You know, the Niners can turn the ball over for you. So those are the things you want. The weird quirk about defenses, though, is that, you know, every year there's always one or two that were great the year before that completely fall off a cliff, and vice versa. There'll be one or two that were kind of awful last year, and either they got a new coordinator or they drafted a piece or two or added somebody in free agency that completely turns it around. So that is one of the more, I think, fluid positions year to year, but I still think you're better off drafting one sort of in the later rounds than trying to play the waiver wire.
Okay, now I can't let you leave the podcast without having this conversation. It was just announced that the New York Jets are going to be on Hard Knocks. Everyone wants to tune in to see what the Jets are going to do. They get Aaron Rodgers. So now I'm coming to you as the fantasy expert. Is Aaron Rodgers going to work in New York?
I think so. But here's the thing. I don't think it's because, you know, I mean, I think in part because of the talent around him, right? Like having a guy like Garrett Wilson to throw the football to, and we'll see if Breece Hall is healthy in the backfield. I think Aaron Rodgers is going to work in New York because he's kind of motivated again. Like I just got the sense the last couple years in Green Bay, like he was just sort of over it, right? I mean, he was taking spirit quests to South America and like dabbling in psychedelics and like he was showing up just in time for class, and that sort of thing. Like I think in New York, he realizes all eyes are on him. It's a new situation. And honestly, knowing for him, like, the clock is ticking on his career. There's only a few more years left. So I think just him being motivated and paying full attention again is what's going to be good for him and the Jets. Now, I don't know if that means a long playoff run. I think this team's good enough to make the playoffs. If they're good enough to get past, the Bills or the Bengals or the Chiefs, that part I'm not sure about, but I do think he's going to have some success in New York.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say is I need to make sure that I grab Garrett Wilson. I should think about Breece Hall, and if I need a quarterback, I might need to consider and kind of kick the tires on the 40-year-old quarterback who is dabbling in psychedelics and all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like right now, Garrett Wilson is probably, I think, a mid-second round pick. Breece Hall is probably, second or third round. Rodgers is sort of he's kind of that fringe QB1 where he's getting drafted as like QB 11 or 12. So it's not like the Aaron Rodgers we saw in his prime where, he's going to give you 45 touchdowns and throw like 5 picks. But he's still good enough to get you 4,000 yards and probably get you 35 touchdowns or so. So he's going to be a quality quarterback. And like I said, the fact that he's, again, paying attention, I think is going to go a long way.
Well, look, man, you know what's going to go a long way? All these notes that I've taken today. I am so ready for my fantasy draft. Marcus, I can't thank you enough for joining the Move to Six podcast. This has been great. Look, it's a little different, but we have learned how to build a team, the best fantasy football team that you can do. Thanks for coming on Move to Sticks.
Appreciate you.